I'd like to start by picking up on some questions that were asked at the end of the hour last week. And I forget who asked the question. But the question was something like, who is a Jew? What makes a person a Jew? And at the time, I was sort of unaware until the next day of this controversy surrounding Whoopi Goldberg and the comment that she made that the Holocaust was not a matter of race. It was just a matter of our inhumanity to each other. And that may have been in the mind of the person asking the question. But given the climate in which we live today in terms of white supremacists and neo-Nazis and Holocaust deniers and the whole folks of that stripe, it might be good for us to talk about that for a few minutes. I think we can say that the Nazis made it a question of race, that in their quest for Aryan supremacy, they've labeled the Jews as an inferior race. But really, historically, being Jewish is an ethnic and a religious designation. And in the Bible, Jews are descendants of Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, and the eponymous ancestor of the tribe of Judah. Judah as a tribe settled in southern Palestine, in the territory in and around what would later be the city of Jerusalem. And that tribal territory, with the addition of a couple of other tribes, became the kingdom of Judah under the rule of David. And perhaps the easiest biblical date to remember is 1000 BC or 1000 BCE, the date that David became king of Judah, and then of the northern tribes as well, the tribes of the northern kingdom. And when the northern tribes were defeated by the Assyrians in 721, Judah is what remained as an independent state until the time of the Babylonians. And so when the Babylonians invaded, destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, they took many of the residents of Jerusalem and the surrounding territory into captivity, principally the aristocracy, the priests, the royal family, and others. And so people, the captives from Judah were held in Babylon for about 50 years, down to 538 BCE, when the Persians defeated the Babylonian Empire. And the Persian emperor, Cyrus, issued an edict to allow the Judeans to return home to Jerusalem and their original territory of Judah. And so the term Jew as a designation of a people really has its origins at that period, from the time of the Babylonian exile on, to refer to those who had returned from Babylon, as well as others that had been taken captive but chose to settle elsewhere in the Mediterranean basin. Some of them chose to remain in Babylon. And so those were the Jews of the diaspora, those scattered abroad. So it's an ethnic designation referring to those descended who trace their descendants, their heritage back to Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob. As a religious designation, Jews are monotheists who subscribe to the Torah or law revealed to Moses at Sinai, and whose lives are governed by its precepts. I mean, they live under the covenant given through Moses at Sinai. And so, as a religious designation, you can be a Jew, in terms of your religious affiliation, apart from being a descendant of tracing your heritage back to the person of Judah. And as a consequence, one can convert to Judaism and become a Jew in the religious sense by conversion. And there are provisions for that, a profession of faith, an act of baptism, and for males, circumcision. You can be included in the Jewish community that way. But there are Jews and there are Jews. I mean, there are all kinds of Jews. And it's a diverse grouping. And so here's some examples. I mean, the Jews most familiar to us, I suppose, are Ashkenazi Jews, the Jews whose roots are in Eastern Europe, Poland and in Russia and in Lithuania, in Germany, and so on. But then there are also Sephardic Jews. These are the Jews of Spain. And when the Jews were expelled from Spain, they took up residence elsewhere in the Middle East and in North Africa. And so Sephardic Jews refer to Middle Eastern Jews, and these Jews, in the Middle Ages and later, their everyday language was Arabic. And so these were Arabic-speaking Jews. So there's a linguistic designation called Judeo-Arabic, and it's Arabic, but it's written in Hebrew characters. So you look at a page in Judeo-Arabic, and at first glance it looks like Hebrew, but it's not Hebrew, it's Arabic. They've simply used Hebrew letters to express, to write an Arabic text. You may have heard of Falasha Jews, Ethiopian Jews, who have a long history, that they trace their history way back. And the tradition or the myth is that they're descendants of the Queen of Sheba. But there was a question, as I recall, a question raised at the formation of the State of Israel about these Ethiopian Jews, if they had the right of return, that they could immigrate to the State of Israel, and the ruling of the rabbis was, well, yes. They practice, Judaism, although racially they're Ethiopian, they're African by race. Probably unfamiliar to us are groups of Jews that have been elsewhere since the Middle Ages. I mean, there are Jews in India, a lot of them along the Malabar coast, on the southwest coast of India, and one of the terms used of them is the Cochin Jews. And so they trace their heritage back to Jews who settled there years and years and years ago. And likewise in China, in the Henan province of China, Jewish community known as the Kaifeng Jewish community. And so there are synagogues in China that go back to the Middle Ages. And so, the Jewish community worldwide is diverse. And even today, in terms of religious practice or religious customs, the Jewish community is extremely diverse. And from the top of the page to the bottom, it's a gradation of very conservative down to very liberal in terms of their interpretation of the tradition. So ultra-Orthodox Jews are the ones we associate with distinctive garb. You find enclaves of them in this country and in the greater New York City area, for example. In the modern state of Israel, these are the ones where the men wear distinctive clothing, long black coats and distinctive headgear. Their practice of religion is very conservative in the sense of attention to matters of the law, of fidelity to provisions of Torah, but they've intentionally separated themselves off, from others. It's a very exclusive community. But then there are other Orthodox Jews who are, conservative and strict in their interpretation of the provisions of Torah or the law, but are not as exclusive in terms of withdrawing from greater society. Hasidic Jews, this is a mystical form of Judaism, has its roots in Eastern Europe in the mid-18th century, 1750 or thereabouts. And Karaite Jews, the word Karaite refers to the reading or recitation of Scripture. And so the Karaite Jews are scripturalists. In other words, the only authority for them is the written biblical text. Whereas for other Jews, the Orthodox Jews, for example, what's authoritative is not only the biblical text, but everything since in terms of the deliberations and decisions of the rabbis in the following centuries. These codifications of Jewish law, known as the Mishnah and later the Talmud, that spell out, how we apply the commandments to ever-changing and new situations. But the Karaites reject that. So I suppose a rough analogy in our terms, would be to think of them as, like biblical fundamentalists. It's only the written text that's authoritative. Anything since then, any later tradition is not. We owe the Karaites, though, the credit because of their attention to the biblical text for many of these medieval Hebrew manuscripts. That the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad Codex were likely products, when they were written in the 10th, 11th centuries, are products of the Karaite community because of their sole focus was on the text and the preservation of the text. And then the last three are the forms of Judaism more familiar to us and largely developed in North America. And so rabbinical authorities in the state of Israel really only recognize Orthodox Jews as religiously Jewish, and sort of, how shall we say, I want to look askance. Maybe that's too strong a word, but see North American conservative Jews, Reform Jews, as not religiously fully Jewish. So the Jewish community is diverse today, ethnically and religiously, but it's nothing new, because already on the pages of the New Testament, we see diversity within the Jewish community. When in reading the Gospels, we hear about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, two different sects of Judaism. The Sadducees were the priestly party. The Pharisees were more a lay-oriented party. The Pharisees held to some doctrines that the Sadducees rejected. For example, the Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead, and the Sadducees denied that, and so on. And then the Essenes are not mentioned in the New Testament as such, but they were a group within Judaism in Palestine at the time. And it's the Essenes that are this community that we associate with the community at the Dead Sea, the group that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. Back, 2nd, 3rd century BC, the Essenes, who had some priestly credentials, felt that the temple leadership had gone astray, had become corrupt, and so in protest, they withdrew to the wilderness and formed this community by the Dead Sea, and it's to them that we credit the scrolls. One's Jewish identity is transmitted from one generation to another by, traditionally it's been through your mother. You're Jewish because your mother was Jewish. Now, Reform Jews, more liberal forms of Judaism say, well, yes, but if your father's Jewish, that qualifies as well. And so Reform Judaism says you're Jewish today because either your mother or your father was Jewish. Well, maybe that's enough on that. Is there any questions about, I don't know, I hope that speaks to the question that was asked last time about who is a Jew. I mean, there are Jews and there are Jews. And I think Carla asked a question at the end last time about what about Israel's traditions before we had a written text. Focus of our gathering is the Bible from then when the Bible was written until now. But what about the time before there was a Bible? And the 5 books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy, we believe have their origins during the Babylonian exile. And when various traditions were brought together, edited and combined into the form that we meet them today in the first 5 books of the Bible. In the editorial activity, biblical scholars attribute to the priests from Jerusalem who had been exiled in Babylon. If you stop to think about it, if the Babylonians destroyed the temple, destroyed the city, kingship was eliminated, so the Jews no longer had a temple, they no longer had a functioning priesthood, they no longer had a king, they no longer had a home territory. So, who are we? Because up until that time, our identity had been associated with those things, with temple and land and king, but we don't have those anymore. And so we posit that the priestly community said, well, we do have the story. And from that time on, it wasn't those institutions that defined the community, but it was the story of their history and their origins. So over the years, biblical scholars have come to the conclusion that there were likely 4 documents, if we can call them that incorporated oral traditions, oral stories about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, about remembrances of Moses, about the time spent in the wilderness, remembrances of the stories of how they came into the land under Joshua, and also there were bodies of legal material, law codes, traditions about ritual, about the worship in the temple, and so on, and also creation stories about how things came to be in the first place, and that these 4 traditions, caught up all of those, these 4 documents, brought together all those traditions as the components that went into this national story. So since the 19th century, biblical scholars talk about 4 documents. We don't have them anymore. This is a scholarly conjecture, but the 4 are known by scholars as first the Yahwist, dating from the 10th century, roughly the time of David and Solomon. Gets its name because one of the marks of this tradition is whenever it speaks of the divinity, it uses the proper name of God in Hebrew, which is Yahweh. And we believe that the word Yahweh ultimately is a verbal form. It is based on the verb to be. And this verb is conjugated in a causative sense. So it literally means the one who caused things to exist or caused things to be. And so it became a proper noun in ancient Israel. And in the Bible, in the modern translations, ever since the King James and RSV and New Revised Standard Version, whenever you see the word Lord printed in capital letters, what's behind that is this proper name Yahweh. Well, why didn't they just write Yahweh in the text? Well, the rabbis, historically, over the centuries, so out of respect for the name, always read something as a substitution, a circumlocution. And so when the rabbis would come across the word Yahweh, they wouldn't say Yahweh. They would simply say the Lord, Adonai. Because out of reverence for the name, you don't want a chance mispronouncing it. So the use of the divine name is one of the marks of this tradition. A tradition from about a century later, we think, is called the Elohist. And one of its marks is whenever it talks about the divinity, it simply says God. Elohim, hence the terminology Elohist. So those are some of the clues to, separating out these strands of various strands that went into the making of the book of Genesis. Deuteronomy is self-explanatory. This is a law code. It's much later. It comes from the 7th century, or achieved its final shape in the 7th century, in the 600s. And then something called the priestly document, which is all of the legislation regarding sacrificial practice, all the stuff associated with the temple, all the material that, like genealogies and so on. Priests were interested in that kind of thing, and so they compiled all of that material, likely into some document form. And it's out of those 4 strands that during the exile, the priestly community put it all together, and the result was Genesis through Deuteronomy, largely as we know them today. So before the Bible, before that the time of the Babylonian exile, when the first books of the Bible took shape, there had already been a long tradition of documents and traditions being collected. Well, to pick up from where we left off last week, last time we introduced a little bit about the Dead Sea Scrolls. We talked about the work of the Masoretes, these scripture scholars who worked primarily in the town of Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee. There was another group of Masoretes working in Babylonia that were keepers of the text. They wanted to guarantee the transmission of the text, and in so doing, they provided notes, and they're the ones that supplied the vocalization. Up until the time of the Masoretic text, Hebrew was simply written in consonants. But people knew, they see a group of consonants and they would know how to vocalize it. I mean, the vowels were, carried in their memory, so to speak. But the Masoretes said, well, we're beginning to lose our facility in being able to vocalize the text, so let's devise a system of vocalization. So they supplied the vowels used now in the Hebrew Bible, and you look at a Hebrew text, above the line and below the line, there are these little markings, dots and strokes, and so on, that represent vowels. Well, for example, this is the word Hesed, an emphatic H, an S, and a D. It's the word for sometimes the Bible translated as loving kindness. It's or faithfulness. But this is just, that's what you have. Well, what vowels do you use with that? Well, the Masoretes said, well, let's assign make a little arrangement of this little pattern of 3 dots below this letter and below this letter. And so those 3 dots represent a short E. So in reading the Masoretic text then, You quickly know how to pronounce this as Hesed. So the Masoretes are responsible for that, as well as a lot of trivia along the margin of a Masoretic text are these little notations represented by abbreviations in Hebrew. They point out such things as, this particular word in this line of Hebrew, this is the only time that it's used in the Bible. Or, just little tidbits like that. They kept track of all this material as a way of preserving the tradition, preserving a text. We also introduced the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad Codex. We'll talk a little bit more about this evening. And we introduced the idea of critical editions of the Hebrew Bible as we know them today, as they're used by biblical scholars and by biblical translators. In other words, these critical editions incorporate all of this material. Insights from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Their base text is one of these great codices like the Leningrad Codex, and they use information that comes from other ancient translations, and they bring it all together on one page, so the person reading the page has all this information at their disposal about variants in the text, how a particular word may have been rendered in another ancient language, and so on. So let's move on, spend some more time. We introduced the idea of the Dead Sea Scrolls last time, but let's spend a little bit more time with it. I sent out one of the handouts. One of the handouts has a map on one side, showing a map of the Dead Sea and the location of the caves. And as you look at that, the Dead Sea community settled at the far northwestern corner of the Dead Sea. And the name for the place in Arabic today is Qumran, which means the ruins of Qumran. And the map, the other close-up map on the right-hand side of the page, shows the location of the caves in the cliff face above the Dead Sea. The map shows up to 10 caves, but they've discovered caves since then. Cave 11, and now there's a cave 12 that was discovered not that long ago. And in those caves were discovered scrolls, and all of the biblical books are represented, at least in some only in terms of fragments, but they're all represented except for the book of Esther. And I think we spoke a little bit about that last time and the reason why that may have been the case. The most dramatic text is the complete scroll of the book of Isaiah. All 66 chapters are intact in that scroll, and that was found in the first cave in 1947. As I mentioned earlier, the Essenes, who had withdrawn to the wilderness, are the ones that to whom we credit, the copying of the scrolls. And when the Roman armies were advancing on Judah and Jerusalem during the Roman-Jewish War in 66 to 70, the Essenes feared that their community would be soon destroyed as well by the Roman armies. And so out of a desire to protect the scrolls, they intentionally hid them in these caves above the Dead Sea. So here again is essentially the same map that's on the handout, showing Qumran and the caves above it, there at the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. This is a slide of the Dead Sea. This is taken from the east shore, looking west across in the direction to where Qumran is. It's taken from the Jordanian side. It's a slide I took back in the 1980s. This is a cliff face at Qumran, and you can see, cave openings here, here, and it was in those naturally formed caves that the Essenes hid the scrolls, and the scrolls rolled up were put in clay jars, a long cylindrical clay jar, and the story is, as recounted in the on the reverse of that insert, or the reverse of the handout, that a young shepherd boy by the name of Muhammad the Wolf had lost one of his goats that he was tending, and he feared that it had wandered up into the along this cliff face, and so he went, poked his head in one of these caves, thinking his goat might be in there, and in so doing, he threw a rock in there, heard something break, and was intrigued by what broke, and he went inside and found these jars with scrolls in them. Somewhat frightened, he went away and came back a day later with his cousin, and they found more of these jars or cylindrical containers with scrolls, and so they took those, thinking that there might be of some value. So they took him into Bethlehem to an antiquities dealer went by the name of Kondo, who was a Syrian Christian. And Kondo in turn took them to the Syrian bishop in Jerusalem, a fellow by the name of Athanasius Yeshua Samuel, who was the Syrian Orthodox bishop in Jerusalem at the time. And so the bishop bought these 4 scrolls, including this great scroll of Isaiah. He bought them for $97. And but the faculty member at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem expressed some interest, was willing to offer $4,000 to the bishop for them, but the bishop thought, well, they might be worth more than that. So guess what he did? Took out an ad in the New York Times. Biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 2200 BC are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. Box F206, The Wall Street Journal. They didn't end up weren't sold to anybody in this country, but they eventually ended up in Jerusalem, And today, I mean, this is the page from the Isaiah scroll. And today, they're housed in what is called the Shrine of the Book, which is part of the Israeli National Museum. And it's a beautiful, beautiful structure. And the dome at the right side of the picture replicates the cover on one of those cylindrical jars. So the architect drew his inspiration from the cover that was used on one of the cylindrical containers for the scrolls. The building in the distance is the Israeli Knesset. So this is built in the modern section of Jerusalem. And inside, as you go into the museum and come up, you can see the interior of the dome above you, like the shape like the cover to the scroll container. And the centerpiece here is they have unrolled the scroll of Isaiah. That complete scroll of Isaiah has been unrolled and wrapped around this in a cylindrical display. And I mean, it's a dramatic presentation of the material. Well, prior to the scrolls, getting from what we might think is the original biblical text to today, these are what we had to work with. The original, the dashed lines represent a line of transmission that we can't reconstruct. But we do have these medieval Jewish manuscripts from the Middle Ages. We do have these translations of the Hebrew text into other ancient languages, Latin, Aramaic, and among Christians speaking Syriac, which is a dialect of Aramaic, there's a translation from the 4th century of the Common Era. And so it's, all we can put our hands on and use are these, and text of the Septuagint, but the one we have in form of a book or codice dates from the 5th century of the Common Era. And so we're dependent on those for our knowledge of the text. But with the discovery of the scrolls, look what we have. We've got a line of transmission that we can document that goes back to a time maybe as early as the 200s BC or BCE. And so we have written documents that have come down to us in the forms of the scrolls. So this has become an important resource for biblical scholars and for translators. And we'll see a brief instance of that a bit later.
Why was the location of the caves? I mean, if the Essenes knew that they went through to the wilderness and they put the scrolls in the caves, they didn't pass that down from generation to generation, or did they just?
Well, after the Roman-Jewish War, we don't know what happened to the Essenes. They just vanished, or were absorbed back into the general populace.
And no one, I mean, we don't, of course, nobody knows if anybody knew and didn't tell anybody.
All we have of them are the documentation that they left themselves. I mean, there's some references to them in other writers at the time, but not much. Should add that in addition to the biblical scrolls, there are also a number of scrolls that were found in those caves. They were products of their own. In other words, there's a scroll that has the rule of the community. In other words, their own rules and policies that governed the community. And so there was their own sectarian documents that not biblical material, but so through reading those, we can get some glimpse into the structure of the community and into whatever distinctive theology they had. They were pretty apocalyptic in their outlook. They thought the end times were coming, and they were upon us in the form of the Romans. The Romans are destroying everything, and this is the end of time. So there's a flavor to some of the Essene writings that's not unlike the book of Revelation or the book of Daniel in terms of flavor or tone. So this is a sample then of the Masoretic text in a modern critical text of the Hebrew Bible. I mean, I simply Xerox this page out of my Hebrew Bible. And over here are the marginal notes left by the Masoretes where they're giving bits of trivia about the text. And you can see the pattern of dashes and dots and so on above the below the line and sometimes above the line, which indicate the vowels and so on. The little open circle here and here, that's a way of footnoting, the Masoretes footnoting. And so when you come across that, that directs you over here, to the whatever note they've made about the text. They made some observation about this word, and so they, direct your attention over here. And so in shorthand, they provide some information about, what observations they made about the text. At the bottom of the page in a modern Hebrew Bible, critical text, are extensive footnotes supplied by the modern editors and through abbreviations and notations that they make. They supply their observations on the text. And so they're noting variants, where other manuscripts vary in its reading from the reading in the master text and so on. So for example, down here, this one here, the B footnote refers back up to the text. And so their shorthand notation here, it says, many manuscripts and Q, which stands for Qumran, for the Dead Sea material. And then they say also compare the Syriac, the Aramaic Targum, and the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate. And so they're noting here that whatever the text was up here, the word up there, that was being not only read in the master text, but it's also in many other medieval texts. Also the Qumran scroll of Samuel read that. And for comparison, you could look at the Syriac, the Aramaic Targum, and the Vulgate to see what they did with that particular word or phrase. And so this apparatus is of use, to biblical scholars and translators today to note where other traditions vary, from the standard. And the standard that they're being used here is this Leningrad Codex from the Middle Ages. So it's the Leningrad Codex from the 11th century is the base text, for the Hebrew Bible that scholars use today. And I'll send these around. These are just fascicles or individual the text broken out by separate books. One's of Genesis, one is of the Psalms, and you can get a glimpse of what that critical text looks like. The Aleppo Codex, I think, as we mentioned last week, is earlier by a century. So it would be the earliest witness that we have, except for the fact that it's missing Genesis through part of Deuteronomy. And so we don't have every book in the Hebrew Bible represented in the Aleppo Codex, but we have all of the prophets. We have Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and so on. I think I showed this last week. This is the cover to the Leningrad Codex. I mean, the hard cover. And this was ended up in the hands of a Crimean Jew by the name of Abraham Furkovich in the mid-19th century. And he in turn awarded it to, or gave it over to the Leningrad Public Library in Russia, where it remains today. But the library had made it available to biblical scholars for reproduction. And so it's the base text represented in those fascicles that are going around. The Aleppo Codex, as I said, a century earlier, and the story, fascinating story of it, is told in this book by this Matti Friedman, this Israeli journalist, about its origins and the time it spent in Aleppo at the synagogue there, and then was eventually brought to the state of Israel after the creation of the state of Israel in 1947. It was feared lost in a fire at the synagogue in 1947, but it was saved by members of that community who were able to spirit it out of Syria and eventually bring it to the state of Israel. And so Friedman tells this fascinating story of the travels of the Aleppo Codex, and it's a fascinating read. I mean, it's an accessible read. It's not overly academic at all, but it reads like a good detective story. And Gretchen has a copy up here. If you're interested in purchasing it, I'd commend it to you.
Or if they wanted to borrow it, they could do that. We could just keep it at the church, and anybody who wants to borrow it could borrow it, check it out, and bring it back. Either way.
Check with Gretchen on how you might want to do that.
Why did they write the opposite direction?
Well, as a left-handed person, it's only natural that you write from right to left. I mean, it's just perfectly natural for me. And then you the front of the book is the back of the book, and so on. Same is true of Arabic. I mean, Arabic is written right to left, and you start at the back of the book and read. But it's just the convention of how it, in antiquity, how Semitic languages, when they adopted a system of writing, they just chose to do it that way. Or another way of, as a left-handed person, I like to say, well, it's that way because God is left-handed. This codex is associated with Aleppo. It was originally written in Tiberias along the Sea of Galilee by the Masoretes. It spent some time in Jerusalem, but then it was taken to Aleppo and became for many, many, many years the possession of the Jewish community in Aleppo, Syria. Aleppo and Damascus have rival claims to be the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. And the guess is that Aleppo was settled about 5000 BC and has been inhabited continually ever since. There is a tradition that Abraham once camped there. Tradition that we shared by Jews, and I would think would be shared by Arabs as well, Muslims as well. The population of Aleppo today is about 1.8 million. It's a big city. The sad thing, though, is within the last decade, it suffered considerable damage or destruction during the Syrian civil war. A striking landmark in Aleppo is the citadel, which is in the oldest part of town. Dating back to the Middle Ages. This is the ramp or approach up to the main gate of the citadel. And so it would have been in this general vicinity, or in the area immediately as close to the citadel, that this historic synagogue would have been located, the synagogue that was destroyed in the riots in 1947 following the creation of the State of Israel. This is a mosque in Aleppo that caught my attention, fairly modern, new mosque, quite striking. And I happened to have the chance to be there for a while on an excavation project in 1983. So these were taken then. This is a Jewish metalsmith doing fine metalwork, brassware. And so there was a Jewish community, not only historically in Aleppo, but even today, there continue to be some Jews in Aleppo. This shot actually is not in Aleppo, but is in Damascus. And I stumbled upon this little shop run by Syrian Jews who specialized in doing fine decorative metalwork. And so this fellow's working on a coffee pot, brass coffee pot. Well, the Aleppo Codex, as I mentioned, started in the copy was made in Tiberias, 930 AD, or the Common Era. Found its way to Jerusalem, was there about, estimate maybe 50 years or so, and then spent a few hundred years in Cairo with the Jewish community in Cairo. And it was these Karaite Jews, these scripturalists, that community in Jerusalem transferred the codex to their community in Cairo. And then it was taken to Aleppo in the 15th century and was there until, about for 10 years after the 1947 fire in the synagogue. It was kept safe by members of the Jewish community. And Eventually, they were able to spirit it out of the country, and so it's came back to Jerusalem, where it remains today, and it's housed in that shrine of the book, along with the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the resources we have for study of the Hebrew text, Dead Sea Scrolls, is Aleppo Codex, the Leningrad Codex, which is provides the whole of the Hebrew Bible, because all the books are represented in that. But there are other medieval Jewish manuscripts that are available for comparative value, as well as other ancient translations that we introduced last time, and we'll talk a little bit more about next week. Translations into Greek, into Syriac, and St. Jerome's translation into Latin. Well, let's end by doing a little case study on a few verses of 1 Samuel 2. And that's, if you refer to the other handouts that I sent out, passed around. One of those is titled The Biblical Text at Qumran. So, 1 Samuel from K4 in the Septuagint compared with the Masoretic text. On the right-hand side of the sheet, I've reproduced the New Revised Standard Version translation of 1 Samuel 2. And this is the song of Hannah, the mother of Samuel, a song that's attributed to her, piece of poetry, that she offers in thanksgiving for the birth of Samuel. It's a very old piece of poetry, and it's been woven into the prose text of the book of 1 Samuel. On the left-hand side of the page is a translation of the same passage, but from the scroll of Samuel found at the Dead Sea. And so at the bottom of the page in the footnotes, the editors note compare and contrast the readings from the K4 text of 1 Samuel with that of the Masoretic text, and also that of the Septuagint translation. The other handout, I've made reference to a couple of verses from that poem as they've been translated over the years. And so the very first verse of chapter 2 as Hannah begins her song, begins as translated in the King James Version. And Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoiceth in the Lord, mine horn is exalted in the Lord, my mouth is enlarged over my enemies, because I rejoice in thy salvation." The Revised Standard Version, 1952, essentially does the same thing, same language, but it's not quite as archaic in language. But I want to call your attention to the repetition of the Lord. My heart exalts in the Lord, my strength is exalted in the Lord. So you got two lines of text. With Lord, in other words, hidden behind that is the divine name Yahweh, as we mentioned earlier. But these are two parallel lines of poetry. And one of the features of Hebrew poetry is parallelism, where the second line essentially repeats or re-expresses in other terms the thought of the first line. Well, what's odd about this is that Lord is used here and then Lord is used again. But elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, when we find such a thing, if Lord is in the first line, in the parallel line, what might we find instead? God. So up here is that word Yahweh. Down here is the word Elohim. And so that offers a nice balance. Lord and God. But the Masoretic text, as translated by the King James and later by the Revised Standard Version, somehow had Lord repeated a second time. Which just is kind of jarring when you think about poetic parallelism in Hebrew. And so what might have happened? I think I tossed out a word last week. There's this long word, ditography. And visualize a scribe moving from one line to the other, and he reads in the Lord up here, and as he moves back and forth, rather than reading in God, he picks up in the Lord from the first time he read it and repeats it again, something like that. But the New Revised Standard Version, look what it does. Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exults in the Lord. My strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in my victory." The Dead Sea text likely had, although there's a gap in the text here, the Dead Sea text likely had in my God, offering that parallelism. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, though, certainly does. It has, in my God in its translation. So by reference to the Septuagint, the Greek translation, and also what seems to be indicated by the Dead Sea Scroll version, that the original likely was one that offered this parallelism between Lord and God. The reference in the next line, "My mouth is enlarged over my enemies because I rejoice in thy salvation," in the King James, is essentially repeated in the Revised Standard Version. In other words, this is what the Masoretic text the translators had in the Masoretic text in front of them. But the Dead Sea Scroll says, "I rejoice in my salvation," or my victory. Hannah speaking of herself. And so the witness here, this seems to be superior, that the Dead Sea text likely reproduces the original, where something has happened along the way such that the Masoretic text used the second person pronominal suffix rather than the first person. So these little bits and pieces that you pick up, by comparison of the Masoretic text with the Dead Sea material. The more interesting change represented by the NRSV in terms of this passage comes at verse 5. There's this line, they that were full have hired themselves out for bread, they that were hungry ceased. And the Revised Standard Version essentially repeats the same translation, ceased. And this is a point at which our increasing knowledge of other Semitic languages in antiquity comes into play. That word here, cease, is spelled that way, hadal. With this emphatic H as the first consonant. But what does it mean to say they that were full have hired themselves out for bread, and they that were hungry ceased? But notice what the New Revised Standard Version does. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry are fat with spoil. Well, where did that come from? Well, we now know there's another word spelled in Hebrew the same way. Oops. But in reality, although written in Hebrew with the same consonant, there's a different initial sound. And so, phonetic equivalent diacritical marks are different. And it has to do with where that guttural consonant was articulated, how far back in the mouth that was sounded. And what we now know is that comes from Arabic, where these two words have remained distinct, and one tells the difference because the Arabic alphabet starts out with the same sign, but in this case adds this dot above it to make the distinction between the two sounds. So this one means to cease, but this one means something else. It means to grow fat or to prosper. And so the consequence, the NRSV translators, making use of this contribution from our knowledge of Arabic, has come up with the translation, those who are full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry are fat with spoil. which is a nice reversal, that the rich have become poor, the poor have prospered. This nice balance or reversal of circumstance. And so the NRSV offers that new translation of this particular verse in 1 Samuel 2. I've made comments in more detail on that on the back side of that sheet. And we've come to see the same thing in a verse in the Song of Deborah, Judges chapter 5, where the distinction between the two, became lost in Hebrew when as Hebrew developed, they could no longer discriminate between this sound and this sound. They sort of held together, and so every time you came across that word, it was always translated, or always had the sense of to cease. In playing with this once, some of you will remember Fuad Haddad, longtime member of this congregation, and I asked him once, because he was a native speaker of Arabic, about this. And he said, "Oh, in Arabic today, that's the verb used to mean to become obese." So I want to end with a thought on another place where this word shows up. It's in Deuteronomy 15, verse 11. And the traditional translation there is that the poor will never cease from the land. And it's an allusion to that verse, an allusion to that verse that shows up in the Gospel of John, in a passage that we'll read on the fifth Sunday of Lent, in the Gospel for the fifth Sunday in Lent, the story of Mary anointing Jesus' feet with perfume, with precious oil. So she does this. I mean, this is expensive perfume. And so Judas protests. Well, that oil could have been sold for a considerable sum, and the proceeds given to the poor. And John has Jesus say in response, the poor will never cease. In other words, it's alluding to this passage in Deuteronomy. You're always going to have the poor with you, but you're not going to have me with you very long. So the fact that she anointed my feet is fine. Essentially, that's what John's trying to say. But if you go back to Deuteronomy 15, in terms of the sense there, the intended sense of the Deuteronomy passage, what if you read it with the other hadal? So in Deuteronomy, the poor will never grow fat off the land. The poor will never prosper. And the very next section of Deuteronomy starts with an implied therefore. The poor will never grow fat off the land. Therefore, open your hands to the needy among you. It's your responsibility as the community of Israel, to attend to the poor. because of circumstance, they're not going to prosper. And so it's up to you to help them. And to me, that makes it makes it, read Deuteronomy in that way, in light of this information, makes sense. And I've played with that over the years. And actually, I found somebody else that's in an article, came to the same conclusion. So that's an example of how not only the comparison of texts, Qumran text and other translations help us to better understand what the original likely was, but just knowledge of the comparative value of Semitic languages can be brought to bear on better understanding what likely was the original text meant by the author. Well, let's end there. And any questions or comments? Or yes, Carla.
Well, thank you for a very interesting presentation, Tom. This last point that you brought up is quite fascinating, because what you seem to imply is that John, the gospel writer, didn't really know, or didn't know the best meaning of the verse that he was raised with, and he has Jesus sort of misled too.
John's version of the story is troublesome. The same story, the same tradition shows up in Mark's gospel. If you read Mark's take on the same story, it's better.
What does he say?
Mark has Jesus say, the poor are always with you. Yes, the poor are always with you, but you have the time and the means to attend to them. I mean, you won't have me. I'm approaching the moment of approaching my hour. I mean, Mary essentially has pre-anointed me for burial. I won't be with you very long, but the poor are always going to be with you, and it's up to you to attend to them. So Mark captures the spirit of Deuteronomy 15. I mean, you can read Deuteronomy 15, and even as it's been traditionally read, if you read it in a larger context, you can't escape the conclusion that what Deuteronomy 15 is seeking to remind the community of is its responsibility to the poor and the needy. But reading the other verb, makes it all the more striking, in my estimation. I mean, this some years ago, the Lutheran pastors in town generally meet weekly for a study of the upcoming Sunday's texts. And I recall a number of years ago, in Lent, this was the gospel text for the following Sunday, fifth Sunday in Lent. And one of my colleagues said, I have parishioners that always wave that in front of me when I bring up questions of the church's responsibility for feeding the poor, supporting the food bank, those kinds of things. And this colleague was just frustrated because this was the proof text people would bring, saying, "Oh well, we don't have to bother with responsibility of the poor." And so I said, well, let's think of it in this way, and think more about the context out of which that saying comes in John. the larger context of Deuteronomy 15, and also the value of seeing it in light of, the take Mark's gospel does on the same story. Any other comments? Or? Well, if you're hardy enough and disciplined enough to come back next week, we'll have another go and work with what we can learn from other ancient translations of the Old Testament into Latin and Greek. And then our final session will be focused specifically on the New Testament. Well, thank you.